Well, hello and welcome to The Point. Whether you're watching at home in the big wide world of the internet, or whether you're here at The Point at 9 o'clock on a Sunday or 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. We're delighted to see you. Our church is designed around you, and we're hoping that you'll find today's talk interesting, informative, and worth discussing. We're continuing our series on the book of Galatians, written by St. Paul very early in the time of the first Christians around 50 AD. And he's writing to Christians in a place called Galatia. So here's a map of Galatia, brought to you by those nice people at Wikipedia. Down at the bottom of the map you can see Egypt, and that's the Nile Delta, that lots of different rivers going as the Nile splits and goes to the Mediterranean. On the right hand side there's Israel. You can just see the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. They're very small. And at the top, above Cyprus, you can see modern-day Turkey, and Galatia is the red blob in the middle. Now, it's significant that Galatia is lots of small towns because Galatia wouldn't have had a very big Jewish community. The Jews are spread out throughout the Mediterranean, but mainly in the big cities and the main ports, whereas Galatia is a rural area full of small villages and small towns, a bit like rural Northumberland, where The Point is based in Hexham. They're our kind of people. And what's more, these people haven't had the Jewish background, so they've no idea about the Jewish law. So when Paul goes to them to spread the Christian gospel, they haven't got any background in religion, or in Christian religion or Jewish religion whatsoever. It's very new to them, as we hope it is to many of our watchers and listeners today. So let's see what Paul has to write to these people after he's established these churches and then gone away and heard about what's been going on. Last week we read how Paul had his own authority, which didn't come from the apostles in Jerusalem, and he continues in that theme today as we look at chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. Then, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. Now, Barnabas is one of Paul's great friends, and he's somebody who he takes with him on many of his journeys. He's known as being a great encourager. He's somebody who helps Paul in his journeys. And Titus is a young Gentile convert. And this is significant because we've got this idea of the Jews and the Gentiles. So the Jews had their religion, which had been going since the time of Abraham, where they followed God and they followed the law. They followed the rules that God set in the Ten Commandments and more. The Gentiles, by contrast, came from a completely different background. They had a non-Jewish background. They may have had their own gods. They may have had all kinds of ideas, but they become Christians. And Titus is a Greek who's become one of Paul's followers. Paul goes on, I went in response to a revelation, and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. And this is quite a clever way of putting it, because if Paul said that he went there and met those people who had no authority whatsoever, then that wouldn't be very good, because that would be rude. But if he said he went to those who had the authority, those who were the leaders, then that would say that he was under their submission. What he actually says is those so-called leaders, those who's esteemed as leaders. I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running my race in vain. So he talks about how he shares with them what he's been saying among the Gentiles and explains what's going on to make sure that he's got the right end of the stick. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. So Titus is clearly somebody who's not Jewish, he's not following the Jewish law, and he was not expected to be circumcised. And for those of you who don't know what circumcision has been called the unkindest cut of all, and it's something that all Jewish boys were done to when they were just a few days old. So Jesus was circumcised, Paul was circumcised, Peter was circumcised, but Titus wasn't, because he wasn't brought up like that, and he wasn't expected to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek, even though he'd come with Paul to see these people. And this matter arose because some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. So Paul is complaining to the Galatians, the people he's writing to, that it was false believers who'd come in, who'd spoilt everything and changed everything, but we stood firm so that the truth might be kept for you. So Paul is saying that when he went to see these leaders, he did not stop. He kept going, he made his point, and they agreed with him. It must have been difficult for those church leaders receiving Paul because he was such a forceful man. On the one hand, they had those people saying to them that new Christians should follow the Jewish laws, and they'd been brought up in the Jewish religion, so they knew what that meant. On the other hand, they had Paul saying, no, these new Christians have to follow their own way. All they need is God's grace, and these laws don't apply for them. They must have found it difficult being in the middle. So they tried to come up with a reasonable compromise, as we'll see as Paul goes on. As for those who were held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favouritism. They added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they recognised that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, and remember, Cephas is another name for Peter. Peter's real name is Simon, but he's called Peter in Greek, the rock, and Cephas in Aramaic, the rock. So James, Cephas and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognised the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. And this is the reference to the poor. This is about a message of getting money to the church at Jerusalem, which had been struggling very much and finding it very difficult. So Paul had a collection from around the churches, including Galatia, to help support the church in Jerusalem. And this showed his sort of commitment to the wider church, and also showed that the Gentiles and the Jews were connected together by this gift of generosity. So the early church decided to have two complementary missions, one to the Gentiles, led by Paul, and one to the Jews, led by Peter, James and John. You might think that the one led by Peter, James and John would be the most successful, because they were missioning to the Jews, people who already knew part of the message and only needed to hear a bit more of the message to understand. And yet, in reality, the most successful by far was Paul's mission, to people who'd never heard the message before, and those who hadn't had the benefit of the Jewish background. We at the point hope that we can reach people who've never heard the message before in the same way, and that we can be successful in the way that Paul was. Which brings me to my questions. Number one, do you confront things that need confronting? Now, I had a bit of difficulty with this question. Originally I asked, are you confrontational? But I thought that was a bit too in your face. Or do you confront people who are wrong? Which again, I thought was a bit aggressive. But are you the kind of person who stands up and makes a fuss about stuff, or do you keep quiet and hope for the best even when you know things are wrong? Number two, what is circumcision today? Well, circumcision is still circumcision. The Jewish religion still does it. But what's the equivalent for the church today? If you're outside the church, not yet Christian, then perhaps you can really help us with this. What are the things that you think the church puts in the way that people have to do before they've become a Christian? So you can become a Christian, but first you have to ... And number three, who are you responsible for sharing the gospel with? Or maybe, with whom are you responsible for sharing the gospel? Now, if you're not yet a Christian, you might be thinking, well, that's got nothing to do with me. But maybe it has, because when you become a Christian, there are people that you'll want to become Christians too, because you'll find it so wonderful. Now, Paul was responsible for the Gentiles, Peter was responsible for the Jews, those were massive groups, but who are you responsible for? The UK? Northumberland? Hexham? Your neighbours? Your family? We could say, well, I'm responsible for sharing the gospel with everybody, but then that sort of boils down to him not really being responsible for anybody. So who could you share the gospel with? Sit down, get yourself a cup of tea. If you're at home, put the video on pause. If you're at the point, find yourself a table, and we'll get back to you in a little bit. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Now I'm going to give you my takeaways for this coming week, and then I'll ask the person in charge to say the final prayer. So what must we do? Well, first of all, we must stand up for what's right. Easier said than done. And I don't know what you'll face this week, where you'll have to stand up for something and realise that you have to stand because nobody else will. That's a difficult place to be sometimes, but throughout history, people have done that and made a difference. Number two, we shouldn't add anything to the gospel. Now that's a bit sort of churchy, but what I mean by that is that the people in Jerusalem were trying to say, oh, you've got to have this before you can become a Christian. We should make sure that everybody realises that they can become a Christian now, and they don't have to be a good person or a right person or follow the law or have any special things beforehand. You can become a Christian today because Jesus accepts you as you are and wants to transform you into being so much more. And number three, we should be an apostle to the ... And I'm going to let you fill in the blank as to who you feel you should be an apostle to. But I'm sure it's somebody. And I'm hoping that at the very least you can say one name. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.